Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. In this week's program, I'd like to address Zoran Mamdani's candidacy for mayor of New York City. I was having a hard time coming up with the title for the program. My first thought was something to the effect of, given Mamdani's positions, the righteous should not vote for him. However, given the entire public's accountability before God, a better title would be, everyone in New York City ought not to vote for Mamdani. But then, considering the fact that churches and religious organizations are 501c3 organizations, I'm not supposed to endorse candidates. But that's been all done away with. Back in July, the IRS changed its policy because they knew it was going to be challenged in court, and they knew that they would lose. But regardless, I'm not technically endorsing a candidate. I'm just telling people the candidate's position and what the Bible says about not voting for such a candidate. There's nothing wrong with a Christian being partisan, because that simply means to have a firm adherence to a party, a faction, a cause, or a person. I certainly would have been a firm adherent to Jesus and would have voted for the release of Jesus over Barabbas. Being righteous necessitates being partisan. I expect people to be partisan. The issue is your partisanship righteous or unrighteous? Are you for Elijah or are you for Ahab and Jezebel? Are you for God or are you for Satan? But it's not wrong to be partisan. So let's begin by taking off the table the silly argument that Christians shouldn't be political or partisan. That's only an argument made by those who don't like who you're partisan for. I'm going to take Charlie Kirk's position on this, that Christians should choose a side. And they should choose the side that most aligns with biblical morality. And that's why he was assassinated. Because evil wants to maintain the lie that the righteous ought to be morally neutral. Well, anyway, in regard to Zoran Mamdani, there are two issues that disqualify him. First, he's a Muslim. Second, he's a communist. So now we have a second silly argument to take off the table, the claim that you can't critique or oppose someone's religious affiliation, when really religion is the same thing as one's ideology or one's worldview, and everyone votes for people on that basis. Here's an article from ABC. Zoran Mamdani's rise in New York City mayoral race sparks anti-Muslim vitriol. Notice the implied bias. If you're opposed to Islam, it's called vitriol. Whereas the article could have been more honest and have been entitled, Mamdani's rise in New York City mayoral race raises question about Islamic ideology. It's reasonable to question a candidate's ideology. It's reasonable to question a candidate's ideology. You don't get a pass just because a religious title is affixed to your worldview. And of course, Al Jazeera, the Islamic news site, had this article: Mamdani's New York victory sparks Islamophobic backlash in the United States. Advocates say attacks targeting mayoral candidates' Muslim identity shows Islamophobia remains tolerated in U.S. politics. So characterizing your opponent's position as a phobia is also a ridiculous argument. It's a red herring. It's a deflection. Of course, people should fear wrong ideas. We should expect people to fear wrong ideas because wrong ideas could ruin a nation. The issue isn't a fear of certain ideas. The issue is whether those ideas ought to be feared or embraced. Claiming Islamophobia is just a way to avoid defending Islam. Christians just need to understand how much they're being gaslighted and manipulated by the media, the deceptive language the media uses. We need to call it out. Any media outlet that makes the argument of Islamophobia or the argument of partisanship should be laughed out of business. Most people don't think, but at least the Christian community needs to think. Now back to the Muslim issue. Islam is a false religion, and Muhammad is a false prophet. And I would even suggest that Muhammad may be the false prophet mentioned in the book of the Revelation. Revelation chapter 20, verse 10, the beast and the false prophet are thrown into the lake of fire. We assume that the false prophet is alive during the apocalypse, but the Revelation simply says that the false prophet gives his influence to the global empire of the Antichrist. And for all we know, this false prophet could be dead and gone. But in the future, his ideology and his followers give influence to the beast. Now, of course, I'm open to the possibility that there may be a new false prophet coming out of Islam, a 12th Imam that Islam says will usher in the end, or maybe a false prophet from some other ism. But in the history of the church, Muhammad has been the great false prophet. His followers have even called him the prophet. And there's no other individual like Muhammad who's completely devastated the church with the sword of Islam, taking over almost all lands and nations that used to be Christian, the entire eastern territory of the Roman Empire and the whole Middle East. And today, this false prophet has 1 to 2 billion people following him, mostly by people being locked into the religion by the threat of the state. So Muhammad is the great false prophet of this age. Islam opposes Christian moral values, Christian culture, Christian law. The Puritan founders of America and our founding fathers were very familiar with Islam. Europe was still battling Islamic aggression in the 1700s. And it's no mistake that America was founded as a Christian nation. Before the Constitution in 1787, individual state constitutions required that candidates for office profess the Christian faith. Our forefathers weren't ashamed of their beliefs. They didn't try to hide their beliefs. They understood that a person's worldview and their religion is everything. They didn't want to become like ancient Israel, being taken over by Baal worshippers. If there's a group of Christians who break away from a Muslim state after having experienced all the persecutions involved in living under Islam, it would be perfectly acceptable for them to now identify their nation as Christian and require that all political leaders hold to the Christian faith, not the Muslim faith. For the purpose is to leave Islam and to start a nation under a new system of beliefs. Now, even though secularists try to claim that nations can be religiously neutral, that's wishful thinking. Every nation has a religion because religion is simply another word for worldview or philosophy. And all historians have concurred that America has had a Christian culture and a Christian civil religion. Now, everyone isn't a born-again Christian, but the key principles of Christianity undergird American civil thought. But even that's eroding. Now, by the time of the Constitution in 1787, the Sixth Amendment in the Constitution reads, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States." Now, that originally was only to be applied to the federal government, not to the states, but soon the courts applied it to the states, which was actually unlawful. But the thinking back then was there didn't need to be a specific law, because that would be hard to test and enforce. A law wouldn't be needed because the public was generally Christian, and the Christian consensus would never vote for a Hindu or an Islamist or a Buddhist or an atheist. Let the vote and the morals of the people determine who wins. Just because there's no specific law requiring a religious belief for a candidate doesn't at all mean that the voting public, therefore, should not have their own personal religious test. Of course, the public is to judge the ideological philosophy of a candidate, and a religion is a huge part of this. In fact, in America, we still have a religious ideological test for those running for office. But it isn't as exclusive as in colonial times. But everyone still believes political leaders must hold to a certain ideology, a certain religion. In what way? Well, the very fact that they have to swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States is actually a faith-based ideological test. If a candidate is a communist or a totalitarian, he cannot honestly claim to believe in or hold to the Constitution of the United States. In fact, in America today, you can be fired from teaching in public school if you advocate for communism. So my point is that there is still a religious test, and the public rightfully applies a religious test when deciding on a candidate. Now, leftists who say there ought not to be a religious test actually have their own religious test. The candidate that they believe in must hold to abortion and the religion of transgender ideology. So even they have a religious test. So let's not be gaslighted or shamed by the left or by the media that you can't have a religious test for a candidate. Don't separate religion from ideology, philosophy, and values. It's actually okay to believe something. And don't be fooled by claims of moral equivalency and pluralism, that all isms are equal. The only people who say such things are moral relativists who don't believe there's any difference between right and wrong. But even they don't believe that themselves because they think they're right in so many of their leftist positions. The enemies of God and truth don't want the Christian consensus to stand for what it believes. The enemies of God certainly believe in what they believe and they promote it, but they don't want you to believe in anything. They want you to be tolerant and multicultural and pluralistic so they can get their foot in the door and take over. It's the oldest trick in the book. Did you hear President Trump's speech at the UN recently? How he exposed the fact that Europe is being taken over by Islam because Europeans no longer believe in the exclusivity and the importance of Christian truth. And so Islam is filling the vacuum. Well, because so many Europeans don't believe in their own heritage. For 1,400 years, Europe has been battling to keep Islam from invading Europe. But now with Europe abandoning Christianity for secular humanism, Europe has opened the doors and invited Islam to come in without a shot being fired. Islam doesn't have to invade Europe through war. All it has to do is to get the Europeans to stop believing in Christianity, or even less, just get Europeans to believe in religious pluralism. And Europe will walk right into the arms of Islam. And we all know that Islam is vocal about its goal of creating a worldwide caliphate. About a third of the nations in the UN are Islamic. Islam's goal is to make that 100%. But you say, wait a minute, doesn't Christianity have the same goal? And Jesus' command in Matthew chapter 28, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. Well, the problem isn't evangelism, and the problem isn't teaching people the truth. The problem is evangelism and the conquest that spreads error. Of course, there's a battle between God and his truth versus Satan, but God should win. And Christ is the rightful king. And Christians shouldn't be ashamed of that. We actually believe there is an absolute truth. You say, oh, you can't say that. You're supposed to have your truth and I'm supposed to have my truth and truth is relative. Well, those are the people who believe in nothing and will fall for anything. Those are the people who are going to fall into darkness and actually get taken over by Islam. So I hope you get a chance to listen to President Trump's whole speech at the UN, where he excoriates Europe for its open borders and, in effect, its abandonment of its belief in Western Christian values. Here's just a clip.
In the United States, we reject the idea that mass numbers of people from foreign lands can be permitted to travel halfway around the world, trample our borders, violate our sovereignty, cause unmitigated crime, and deplete our social safety net. We have reasserted that America belongs to the American people, and I encourage all countries to take their own stand in defense of their citizens as well. You have to do that because I see it. I'm not mentioning names. I see it, and I could call every single one of them out. You're destroying your countries. They're being destroyed. Europe is in serious trouble. They've been invaded by a force of illegal aliens like nobody's ever seen before. Illegal aliens are pouring into Europe. Nobody is ever, and nobody's doing anything to change it, to get them out. It's not sustainable. And because they choose to be politically correct, they're doing just absolutely nothing about it. And I have to say, I look at London, where you have a terrible mayor, terrible, terrible mayor, and it's been so changed, so changed. Now they want to go to Sharia law, but you're in a different country. You can't do that.
Now, of course, the president can't come out and say what I can say in this program, that this is really about the invasion of Islam and the false prophet Muhammad. But everyone pretty much knows what President Trump was speaking to. And London has become London-stan. And now in America, the largest city in America is about to elect a Muslim mayor, because the people no longer believe in the importance of Christ and his truth, and they're naive concerning Islam, being told a lie that Allah and the God of the Bible are the same. But they're not the same. Just like Baal and Jehovah were not the same. Just like Artemis and Zeus were not the same as the holy God Jehovah. Just like Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva of the Hindus is not the same as the God Jehovah. In the first commandment, you shall have no other gods before you. As Paul writes to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the things to which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to become sharers in demons. Demons actually stand behind these misrepresentations of God. And how a candidate views the world and law is intrinsically tied to his religion. It's no mistake that every Islamic country in the world is a totalitarian state. Individual human rights and property rights are not intrinsic to Islamic law. Jihad, in its opposition to European Christianity and Christian values, is really linked to Marxism in its battle against European values. If you don't understand this, you need to read up on this ideology. Here's a good article explaining it. Quote, Marxism reveals its latent theological dimensions most clearly through Islam, and is aligned with a religion that seeks total dominion. Thus, Marxism now attains its fullest expression as a political revolutionary doctrine within the framework of Islam. And this is what we find, that Islam and Marxism are starting to join. To continue, Islam is discovering its ability to penetrate the West only through Marx. Jihad, like Marxist revolution, is part of a continual struggle. Historically, this represents one of the final stages of the war against the spiritual formation of classic liberal enlightenment, which began to develop from the union of the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation, reaching its peak in 17th century England. Well, this brings us to our second objection to the candidacy of Zohran Mamdani. He's a communist. And it's no coincidence that being a Muslim, he's also a communist. Like the Islamist Ilhan Omar, representing Minnesota's 5th District, and other Muslims in Congress, Rashid Tlaib and Andre Carson and Yasmin Ansari, they're all socialist communists. Even Wikipedia will tell you that socialism is communism. But the word communism is not used because if you call yourself a communist in America, that's political suicide. But you can still get away with calling yourself a socialist. It's really the same thing. Now, Mamdani is not a member of the Democrat Party, but a member of the Democrat Socialist Party of America, the DSA, which is the communist wing of the Democrat Party. Zohran's father was a professor at Columbia, which is a hotbed of communism. And Zohran has been recorded many times making communist statements, such as the state needs to take over the means of production, or that the state needs to create communal living, free public transportation, state-run grocery stores. In one interview, he said the family he grew up in made him more open to being a radical and taught him that socialism needs to be rebranded to sell it to the American people. Also, Zoran has no background in business. His major in college was African studies. And here he is at age 33, and he's never really held a substantial job. He lives in a rent-subsidized apartment, which is illegal given his personal wealth. He wants free stuff, and he attracts everyone to him who also wants free stuff. And there's really no doubt that Mamdani is a socialist communist. That's not even an argument. I mean, he didn't win the primary in spite of being a communist. He won it because he was a communist. Here's a clip of Mamdani speaking about his housing plan.
We'll have to go beyond the market. We can establish community land trusts to gradually buy up housing on the private market and convert it to community ownership. We can give tenants a right of first refusal to buy out their landlords when buildings go up for sale. And we can fully commit to a new era of social housing, ending subsidies for luxury housing development and using our wealth to build beautiful, high-quality social housing projects that offer good homes and strong communities to everyone. We won't decommodify housing overnight, but we know what we have to do, and we have history to guide us.
Decommodifying the housing market is code for housing becoming like healthcare, a right given by government, something that should not be bought or sold, but something that's taken care of by government. Now, this would take an entire program to discuss, and I've dealt with it in the past, but if America would just follow biblical law, the laws given to Israel concerning land rights, we wouldn't have such a housing problem. Families wouldn't have to spend 30 years of their lives just to afford a house on a tiny little lot. The solution to the housing crisis is not communism, where the state owns everything. The solution is actually more capitalism, more private ownership. The problem with housing in New York City is not because the system is capitalistic, but because it's already communistic, with rent subsidies, rent stabilization, public housing, which locks people into the system. Whereas normal people and businesses would have already voted with their feet and moved to areas in America that were 10 times cheaper than New York City. I actually feel sorry for those people in New York City. It's overcrowded, it's overpriced, and the solution is not to have the government to pay you to stay, but to allow for natural economic forces to work, for people to begin to move out to cheaper areas. There are 1.5 million New Yorkers living in the city on Social Security benefits. And they could be living like kings in Tennessee or South Dakota or Mississippi, but they don't know any better. Complaining that New York City is too expensive is like someone working an unskilled job and then complaining that it's too expensive to live on Fifth Avenue. The market is screaming at you to move to so many better, cheaper places. There are so many places where rent is only $500, $600, $700 a month. But my point is this. The Bolsheviks come along, the communists, and they tell people that the solution is more government ownership rather than the biblical model of private ownership and government non-interference. It's a governmental and a governmental monopoly problem that makes housing unaffordable. But anyway, just like Russia in 1917, when the Bolsheviks convinced the public to support their communist revolution, they promised free stuff. And the same thing is happening in New York City. And people who do not have a moral compass and who judge everything on the basis of personal gain easily fall for the lie because they're far from God and they're biblically illiterate. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Christian Russian dissident, famously said in a speech at America, "Under the decades-long assault and militant radicalism of many so-called liberals and progressive elites, God has been progressively erased from our public and educational institutions in Russia to be replaced with all manner of delusion, perversion, corruption, violence, decadence, and insanity. It's no coincidence that as Marxist ideologies and secular principles engulf the culture and pervert mainstream thinking, individual freedoms and liberties are rapidly disappearing. Those of us who have experienced and witnessed firsthand the atrocities and terrors of communism understand fully why such evil takes root, how it grows and deceives, and the kind of hell it will ultimately unleash on the innocent and the faithful. Godlessness is always the first step toward tyranny and oppression. More than half a century ago, while I was still a child, I recall hearing a number of older people offer the following explanation for the great disaster that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why this has all happened. Since then, I've spent nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I've read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies. I've already contributed 8 volumes of my own toward the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate a concise as possible main cause for the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Unquote, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Now, in addition to Mamdani's communism and his adherence to the false prophet, we also have to mention his anti-Christian stance toward Israel. He has publicly stated that he wants to globalize the intifada against Israel. He has publicly praised organizations that raise funds for Hamas. He says that if he's the mayor, he will arrest Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, if he ever steps foot in New York City. And Mamdani's popularity is due to the fact that open immigration has resulted in at least 800,000 Muslims now living in New York City. New York City, which has the largest population of Jewish people outside of Israel, is about to elect a Muslim as their mayor. And this is stirring not only talk of businesses leaving New York City because of the mayor's communism, but Jews are also speaking of leaving. One leader who survived the Holocaust was asked, what did you learn from the Holocaust? He said, we learned that when someone says he wants to kill you, believe him. Now, if I had to guess what the plan of God is here, it's that God will allow Mamdani to become mayor to fulfill what we often see in Scripture. God raising up foolish leaders to punish an ungodly citizenship, one who will destroy the city through foolish policy. Isaiah chapter 3, God says that he's going to remove the honorable leaders and make infants their princes, and capricious children will rule over them so that they will be oppressed. And a second possible reason why God may be allowing Mamdani to be mayor is the end-time prophecy that God will be whistling for the Jews to bring them back to the land of Israel. Zechariah chapter 10. And God often does this by persecution and anti-Semitism, just like many Jews are leaving Europe and emigrating to Israel because of the rise of Islam and anti-Semitism in Europe. God has a plan, and he's working all things for the good of his people. But as Christians, we do know this. We still have to vote for the most righteous, the most biblical candidate. And this is one of Jesus' key teachings in Matthew chapter 18, verse 7. Jesus said it's necessary for offenses to come. God knows it's necessary for evil to arise in order to punish evil. But then Jesus says, woe to the man who brings about those offenses. Now, such was the case with those who crucified Christ. They meant it for evil, but God turned it around for our good. But still, the righteous man is never to support evil, even though God may turn it around for our good. The righteous should not be voting for Zoran Mamdani, but God may allow his victory so that he becomes the rod of God's judgment. Thanks for listening. Stand firm in the faith, and may Jesus Christ reign.